My parents told my husband he deserved better, and they all left me because I couldn't have children. 3 years later, they were surprised to see me with a baby girl. At 30 years old, I recently found myself unexpectedly face to face with my parents and my ex-husband, Scott, who is 33. The encounter left me bewildered and uncertain about my emotions. For some background, it's been nearly 3 years since I've spoken to either my parents or Scott. Our divorce 3 years ago marked the end of our communications. I had exerted considerable effort to ensure our paths would never cross again, primarily because their presence in my life had once severely impacted my mental health, to the point where I questioned my own worth. Following our separation, I relocated to the suburbs to start anew, distancing myself from all remnants of my previous life. Thus, stumbling upon them recently was startling, prompting me to react in ways I now question whether were appropriate. Growing up, it was apparent that my parents yearned for a son. They didn't mistreat me, but the preference was clear, and it shaped much of our interactions. My mother often voiced this desire, and in response, I endeavored to fill that void, though without success. After college, I maintained a connection with them, driven by the belief that, despite everything, they were still my family. They were all I had, given my distant relationship with my grandparents and the absence of supportive uncles or aunts. This connection persisted as a constant in my life, even as they remained somewhat aloof. At 23, my relationship with Scott began. We clicked instantly after meeting at a concert, and 6 months into our relationship, when I introduced him to my parents, I noticed a shift in their efforts to engage with me. It seemed that having Scott in my life momentarily brought us closer. Their renewed interest in my life was palpable. They called more frequently and eagerly inquired about my relationship with Scott. I noticed this shift in their behavior, and although it was a positive change, I didn't scrutinize it too deeply, but rather embraced it wholeheartedly. As my relationship with Scott deepened, so too did my parents' involvement in our lives. Eventually, it seemed as though we had formed one big, happy family, a dream I had long cherished, so I refrained from questioning the sudden warmth. After dating for over 2 years, Scott and I got engaged and subsequently married, having been together for a total of 3 years. The initial phase of our marriage was blissful, filled with the joys of new beginnings. However, about 6 months post-marriage, the topic of grandchildren began to surface in conversations with my parents. I was only 26 then, and the idea of motherhood felt premature. I envisioned waiting a few more years. Despite my hesitations, their persistent nudging led me to discuss the possibility with Scott, who was surprisingly enthusiastic about starting a family sooner than planned. Driven by Scott's eagerness, we decided to try for a baby. Months passed without success, prompting us to consult medical experts, only to discover my infertility, a revelation that stunned us both, but seemed to devastate my parents even more. Their reaction to our struggle was painfully apparent. When we broke the news, my father's immediate response was to leave the room, offering no words of comfort or support. In the wake of this, Scott and I considered alternative methods like IVF, aware of the significant costs and uncertain outcomes. We agreed to postpone our plans to expand our family until we could financially handle the expenses of multiple IVF cycles if necessary. Although Scott and I came to terms with this decision, my parents did not. Their visits and calls dwindled until they ceased altogether. Despite my efforts to explain and reassure them that my infertility was beyond my control, they remained aloof, unwilling to engage or understand our situation. Weeks after the unsettling revelation about my infertility, the frustration and disappointment with my parents' reaction reached a tipping point. Overwhelmed by a sense of betrayal, I finally confronted them over the phone. I expressed my deep hurt over their harsh treatment, merely because I couldn't provide a grandchild at the moment. I questioned their capacity to be compassionate grandparents in the future, considering their current inability to show empathy. During the call, I also addressed a long-standing grievance, how they had always favored a son over me and clearly shown preferential treatment towards Scott. For years, I had tried to overlook this, maintaining a relationship based on the faint hope of gaining their approval. However, the pain they inflicted by rejecting me due to my infertility was the last straw. I declared my intention to sever our ties permanently, requesting that they refrain from contacting me again. Contrary to my hopes for a remorseful acknowledgement, They reacted defensively, insisting they were justified in their actions. They even expressed relief over my decision to cut communications, cruelly dismissing my worth as a woman and a daughter because of my inability to conceive. Their words cut deeply, yet they clarified the painful truth of our relationship. After ending the call, I shared the heartbreaking conversation with Scott. Initially, he showed great empathy, providing the support I desperately needed. However, as days turned into weeks, I sensed a distressing shift in his demeanor. Despite the turmoil I was already facing, I began to deny the growing signs of his emotional withdrawal, fearing the potential collapse of another vital relationship in my life. I forced myself to believe everything was normal, but Scott's transformation was too profound to ignore. Within months, the warm man I married had grown distant and cold, altering the dynamic of our relationship drastically. Despite the crumbling state of our marriage, I poured every ounce of effort into salvaging our relationship, clinging to the hope that we could turn things around. But my attempts were in vain. 3 months into our strained living situation, Scott returned home one day, his face grim, clutching divorce papers. He declared he was done. Although I wasn't completely taken aback, desperation led me to suggest delaying our plans for children instead of ending our marriage. He dismissed the idea, stating that there were many reasons behind his decision, reasons he wished not to discuss, and expressed a desire to expedite the divorce process for both our sakes. The ensuing 7 months of legal proceedings were the darkest and most isolating of my life. I was utterly alone, emotionally shattered. The situation worsened a few weeks after Scott had moved out, when I learned from relatives that he had taken refuge with my parents. Confused and seeking answers, I reached out to my in-laws, who reluctantly revealed that my parents had been in contact with Scott for months. They suspected that my parents might have influenced his decision to leave, perhaps convincing him that he deserved better, a notion that pained me deeply. My in-laws disagreed with Scott's decision but were powerless to change his mind, as he had cut ties with them as well. The specifics of what my parents told Scott remained unclear, but it was evident that their desperation for a son, or at least a male ally, had driven them to weave Scott into their lives at the expense of our marriage. In the wake of the divorce, my recovery was slow and fraught with pain, but I eventually found the strength to rebuild my life. I moved to a new home in the suburbs, secured a new job, revamped my appearance, and took definitive steps to cut all ties with my parents and Scott, including blocking them on all social media platforms. This marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where I focused solely on healing and moving forward, leaving the anguish of the past behind. In the aftermath of my divorce, I made it clear to all my friends and relatives that I wanted no updates about my ex-husband or parents, nor did I want them to share any information about me. Everyone respected my wishes, and over the past 3 years, I have been attending therapy and living a much better life. Despite the lack of a husband or parents in my life, the desire to be a mother remains strong. Last year, I embarked on IVF treatments using an anonymous donor and successfully became pregnant. 4 months ago, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, bringing immense joy into my life. Everything was going well until about 4 days ago, when I was out for a walk with my daughter. That's when I unexpectedly ran into my parents and Scott. They were coming out of a house a few blocks away from where I stood. The sight of them made me freeze in place. I thought they might have been there to see me, but it turned out they were visiting Scott's aunt, who had recently moved into the neighborhood. As they approached and started talking to me, they immediately inquired about my daughter, having believed I was infertile. I told them the truth about her. As I began to walk away, Scott stopped me. He expressed his happiness at seeing me, mentioning he had been thinking a lot about me lately. He saw our unexpected meeting as a sign from the universe that we should reconsider our relationship and possibly reconcile. My parents, who were also there, urged me to invite them over to catch up on everything they had missed. They seemed eager to be part of my life again, suggesting we have a detailed conversation about all the recent events. I was completely shocked that they thought I might invite them in after everything they had done. It took me 3 years to start moving past our history, and I'm still in therapy working through my emotions. Overwhelmed, I snapped and told them I'd rather have wild animals in my home than them, because even animals would be kinder. I accused them of faking their concern for me, pointing out that they were only interested now because I had a baby. I told them that my parents saw this as their chance to finally have a grandchild, and Scott was trying to reconnect because he hadn't found anyone else, and thought since I managed to have a baby once, I could easily do it again. It was clear to me that they viewed me not as a person, but merely as a means to have children. Their lack of support when I needed them most had hurt deeply, especially since I had always known my parents preferred a son and saw a woman's worth only in her ability to mother. But what really hurt was Scott's betrayal. After years of being together, where he had once comforted me, he chose to side with my parents and abandoned me when I was vulnerable. I hadn't forgotten their harsh words and threw them back at them. Since I was worthless as a woman and Scott deserved better, I insisted they should leave me alone for good. Typically, I'm quiet and reserved, but the encounter on the street unleashed 3 years of pent-up rage. I found myself shouting at them, letting out all my anger. Once I finished, I didn't wait for their response. I turned, ran back to my house, and slammed the door shut behind me, leaving them and the confrontation outside. After the confrontation, I felt terribly unwell, so I decided to take a few days off work to stay home and recover with my baby. The encounter with my parents and Scott kept replaying in my mind, leaving me unsure about how to handle everything. This confusion lingered until last evening when an unknown number called me. I usually ignore unknown calls, but something compelled me to answer this time. It was Scott on the other end, and I could hear my parents whispering behind him. It seemed like they weren't even trying to hide their presence. Perhaps they wanted me to know they were there. Trying to maintain my composure, I firmly told Scott that this should be our last conversation and warned him that I'd take legal steps if he or my parents contacted me again. I picked up the call mainly to make it clear to them that I was done with them, just as I had been for the past 3 years. Despite my resolve, Scott pleaded with me to listen. I hesitantly allowed him to speak, and he admitted that he and my parents had made mistakes. He explained that their actions stemmed from disappointment. They had been eager to start a family and were upset when they learned about my infertility and our financial wait for IVF. He admitted they hadn't handled the situation well, but claimed they now wanted a second chance to show they could be part of my life. After hearing him out, I responded without hesitation. I told him I didn't believe their excuses. Their sudden interest was solely because they had seen me with my baby. If they hadn't seen me that day, they wouldn't have cared at all. That was the undeniable truth. The truth was clear, and I was tired of their attempts to twist it. As I was about to end the call, my parents interjected from the background, accusing me of the very selfishness that led them to cut ties. They claimed that when I learned of my infertility, I demanded constant comfort and attention, overwhelming them as they too struggled with the news. This, they said, was why they ultimately pushed me away, leaving me isolated. I didn't entertain their excuses any longer and hung up the phone. Despite knowing they were trying to manipulate my feelings, their words left me doubting myself. For my own peace of mind, I had to reflect on whether I had indeed sought too much reassurance after my diagnosis. To address another query that many people had, why my parents didn't try for another child if they desperately wanted a son, my mother faced severe complications during her pregnancy with me. The doctors had advised waiting a few years before attempting another pregnancy. However, by the time it was feasible, she was already in her mid-30s, which meant any subsequent pregnancy would carry higher risks. Like me, she struggled greatly to conceive, and during her difficulties, it was her mother-in-law who was unsympathetic. In a cruel twist of fate, when I faced similar challenges, it was my own mother who showed no empathy. That's why they never had more children, leaving them with just one daughter, me. As for Scott's relationship with his parents, they seem to have a good rapport from what I observed, but I'm not sure if they've reconciled since their last disagreement. I haven't kept in touch with his parents, and I certainly haven't discussed any of this with Scott. Scott is an only child and was deeply cherished by his parents. Whenever I visited them, it was clear they loved him dearly, and he had a very comfortable upbringing. This makes it all the more puzzling why he grew so attached to my parents. I understood why my parents gravitated towards Scott. They had always wanted a son and treated him as such. However, I couldn't figure out what drove Scott to reciprocate so intensely. For the past 3 years, I've been trying to put all these painful memories behind me, so I hadn't dwelled much on these dynamics. But your questions have sparked my curiosity, compelling me to probe deeper into the situation with my ex-in-laws, if only to satisfy my own need to understand. Update 1. I decided to reach out to my ex-in-laws to uncover the reasons behind Scott's odd behavior. It struck me as particularly odd that he would need to visit his aunt alongside my parents. I was already certain that my painful past was not my fault, but a consequence of their poor character. Convinced they were attempting to manipulate my perceptions, I sought reassurance but preferred not to burden my friends with such personal issues, which is why I turned to this forum. I'm grateful for everyone's support here, reassuring me that I was not at fault. Reconnecting with my ex-in-laws after 3 years of silence was awkward, especially since our last interaction was around the time of my divorce. Fortunately, they were receptive to my call. After some initial small talk, I directly asked them about Scott's unusual closeness with my parents and whether they had been in contact with him. They revealed that they had reconciled with Scott a few months after their last disagreement and were currently in touch. However, Scott had also maintained contact with my parents. They assured me that his actions were not an attempt to replace them. He had simply continued to engage with both families. It turns out that my parents had been quite manipulative from the start of my relationship with Scott. Even while we were dating, they would often invite him to dinner when I was unavailable, building a rapport with him behind my back. Scott felt flattered by their attention, bragging to his own parents about how well he got along with mine. His gender alone seemed enough to win my parents over, and over time, he began to view them as additional parental figures, despite having loving parents of his own. This situation grew increasingly complicated. My parents lavished Scott with expensive gifts and frequently wrote him checks. Later, I learned that the funds Scott proposed using for our IVF treatments actually came from my parents. At the time, I doubted we had the means for IVF and was wary of any unethical ways he might obtain such funds. Scott kept the financial support from my parents a secret to avoid disclosing the extent of his relationship with them. This secrecy and my hesitation to proceed with IVF were used by my parents to sow discord, convincing Scott that he deserved a partner who had more faith in his intentions. Within a few months, their manipulations took root, and Scott decided to leave me. My ex-in-laws were apologetic about the situation when I spoke to them, acknowledging that they disapproved of Scott's relationship with my parents. However, as their only son, they felt they couldn't sever ties with him despite the circumstances. I appreciate my ex-in-laws for being forthcoming with the truth. They don't owe me anything, and their honesty was a kind gesture. But now that I'm aware of the reality, I see no reason to engage with any of them if they attempt to reach out. They've shown their true colors, and they're not worth my time or energy. Update 2. After taking nearly 2 weeks off, I decided it was time to return to work. Fortunately, I had plenty of leave days left from my maternity leave, thanks to my company's flexible policy. At home, it was just my daughter and her nanny, whom I trust completely. She's not only highly recommended, but also someone I know personally and consider incredibly capable and caring. Midway through my workday, I received an unexpected call from her. She informed me that out of concern for safety due to my ex-husband's behavior, she had decided to take my daughter to her own home. I agreed immediately, believing it was the best decision to ensure their safety, and I called the police while I hurried home. She explained over the phone that Scott had appeared outside my house shouting and demanding I come out. When he realized I wasn't home, he began trying to break in, his actions fueled by anger. Thankfully, the nanny acted swiftly. She called me so I could alert the police, and she then safely exited through the back door with my daughter, walking to her nearby home. By the time I arrived, the police were already handling the situation. It was evident from Scott's demeanor that he had been drinking, which only added to the chaos of the moment. I am profoundly grateful to the nanny for prioritizing my daughter's safety above all else. Her quick thinking and decisive action kept my child safe during a potentially dangerous situation. It was bizarre, seeing Scott so inebriated around noon. Fueled by frustration and a desire to protect myself and my daughter, I decided to press charges against him and pursue a restraining order. This incident provided the perfect justification for that. The police promptly took him away, and shortly after, my nanny returned with my daughter. I gave her the rest of the day off as I planned to spend it with my daughter. Given the circumstances, I'm considering taking a few more days off work. However, I'm not upset about it. Spending time with my daughter, my favorite person, is something I cherish. Update 3. It's been a few weeks since my last update. Life has been hectic with my daughter and a new project I've started, which has been quite exciting. Here's the latest on Scott and my parents. I successfully obtained a restraining order against Scott, supported by security footage from his drunken episode at my home. This seemed to discourage my parents from attempting further contact, and they've kept their distance. Meanwhile, my ex-in-laws shared that they've cut ties with Scott following the incident. It appears he's been struggling to find a partner who shares his desire to start a family, disliking the idea of adoption as an alternative. This might explain some of his recent behavior, but it certainly doesn't excuse it, nor does it earn him my forgiveness after everything he and my parents have put me through. Despite their absence, my parents haven't stopped trying to tarnish my reputation among relatives. Fortunately, their attempts haven't been successful. Everyone is aware of their actions and the hurt they've caused me, and no amount of playing the victim on their part changes the narrative. It's clear now that they won't ever have a relationship with their grandchild, a decision I firmly stand by. My daughter and I are building our lives together, free from unwanted interference. Inspired by my experiences, I'm committed to being a far better parent than the examples set by my own.